Thanks everyone for joining us at the Project Censored Radio Show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your co-host Eleanor Goldfield along with Mickey Huff, and we are very glad to be joined by Federico Campagna, who's an Italian philosopher and writer based in London. He is the author of Otherworlds, Mediterranean Lessons on Escaping History, which we're going to discuss today, as well as Prophetic Culture, Recreation for Adolescence, Technic and Magic, The Reconstruction of Reality, and The Last Night. He is the director and co-founder of Agora, a fully funded school of art and philosophy produced by the Centre d'Art. I'm not even going to try to say that because my French isn't good enough. He is a visiting lecturer in world building at the MA Fashion Royal College of Art in London, a lecturer in intellectual history at the MA Fine Arts, and associate fellow at the Warburg Institute in London. Federico, thanks so much for joining us.
Eleanor, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, thank you so much. I assume people think that I always say this, but like, just wow, this book, Otherworlds, Mediterranean Lessons on Escaping History. I read a lot, and I very rarely just put the book down and go, "What? This is amazing." And I did that several times. Not just because of the writing style, but the concepts and ideas. And I want to dig into that today because on this show, we typically talk about the news that didn't make the news, about censorship, about what's about propaganda, about what's hiding behind the headline. And one could easily make the case that this is that on a macroscopic scale across space and time. Stories that were carried in pockets, stories that created worlds when the so-called real world was being destroyed by certainties and monoliths. Stories that aren't included in history books, save yours, aren't splayed across headlines unless they clash with the headlines in the way that dreamers sometimes do, ridiculed or sidelined. And so I feel that in the times where we are, as a previous guest of ours, Mohammed Bamier, put it, where reality is unacceptable, we have to look to the imagined and the illogical and the unrealistic. And as you write, the people of the Mediterranean would therefore also move, quote, beyond space and time, outside the confines of history. So, starting off here, Federico, I want to ask you about imagination as a frame or a lens through which to view reality, because those that imagine are not unaware of reality. They're not merely denying it as existing, they're denying it as acceptable. Because the argument is so often, oh, you just have to live in the real world. Stop, don't have your head in the clouds here. But it seems that there's an argument that our connection to the past, our feelings of solidarity, of kinship with those who have struggled as we do, or found joy and despair as we do, they too have been imagining something outside of what they were living. So could you talk about that seeming contradiction between imagination and reality that sort of forms this backbone of your book?
Hmm. Yeah, well, the idea that we have to go back to reality coming out of our imagination would require something that is not the case, so that we can access reality from outside of our mind, that we can have a direct, objective understanding of what's going on around us that is not filtered by the limits of our mind, the limits of our cognition, the limits of our senses. We would need to be God, or at least the idea that we have of God, an omniscient being that is capable of understanding everything beyond space and time in its infinite depth. That's clearly not the case. Another possibility would be that for some strange miracle, the specific limits of the human imagination, of the human mind, of human knowledge and technology of the 21st century in this part of the world coincide with reality as it is. Now, that's a very wild bet, and I think statistically the probabilities that is true are negligible. That is to say that we cannot access reality outside of our imagination. Whatever we see around ourselves is in our imagination. What's happening around us is infinitely more than we can apprehend. What we apprehend is not just a fragment of this infinity, but is a fragment that we curate, modulate, put together, and re-narrate to ourselves in the form of a story. It's an imagination. We have many different ways of going about this job of imagining the world, and that's why the world is different from reality. Different societies, different civilizations have done this job differently. Within each civilization or society, different groups adopt different strategies to try to simplify the chaos of reality into a story. None of them is reality with a capital R. None of them is objective, and none of them ultimately, fundamentally, is true or real. They are all fictional. Each of them produces consequences, though. So if we imagine, if we make sense of what we witness around ourselves, for example, by dividing two main groups of living beings, humans and animals, okay? This is a legitimate way of making sense of what we experience, of the variety of living beings. It has a destiny implied to this. It has a consequence implied to this. Humans and animals have different interests and they take different rights. We could do the same within humanity, men and women. Or we could do it also by recognizing that certain things, although invisible, exist, like currencies or passports and nationalities. Now, these are all legitimate ways, but they bring about very different ways in which we inhabit the world and make sense of our lives. We make sense of what we can and cannot do, what exists and what doesn't exist. In this book, I have looked at the stories, the true stories, of legions of people across the millennia who found themselves in a very difficult tight spot in history. History had decreed that there was no longer any room for them in the majoritarian, hegemonic, so to say, technically, narration about the world that was taking place in their society, in their time. They were being erased or cast out. And they then replied by escaping, mostly, fighting often, but also by reinventing the idea of what the world is, by operating on their imagination and saying, you know what? I have an alternative narrative about what's going on, about what is the real world. The narratives were just as good, philosophically just as sound, and just as fictional as all the others.
Yeah, and I want to dig into that a little bit because there's this escape from history has a sort of borderless anarchistic vitality to it, be it like the repurposing of Alexander or the very real Al-Andalus, or the fleeting Fiume. There is this negation of what one might call today the nation state monolith mentality, a negation of hard lines that separate us from the other. And as you write, quote, the essential lesson of the Mediterranean imagination, establishing the conceptual conditions for the flourishing of all, rather than chasing an impossible truth, should be the aim of our efforts to interpret the infinite mystery of reality, end quote. And you have a chapter on traitors, and these traitors then are really just traitors against these systems that are death making, that push against this chaos of reality with a synthetic but deadly force. Giovanni Pico and the Corsairs, and the appreciation and respect of the other, as contrasted to the Northern European powers or nation state aspects. And I'm wondering do you feel that reaction to these false demarcations, is that just a kind of reaction, a response to what was happening in those times, or is it indicative of something deeper, more inherent in human nature that calls out for community and solidarity?
I wouldn't know about human nature. It's always a very difficult topic, human nature, whether there is one. I suspect that human nature as well is one of those fictions through which we live the world, which means that you can have a very interesting narrative on human nature. But once again, you can judge the quality of your narrative on human nature depending on the consequences. And I think many of the traitors that we have in the book did something similar. They were presented with some ideas that were prevalent in their society, and these ideas were presented as true, as absolute factual, objective truth. The consequences of these ideas were catastrophic for them and for people around them, or at least they judged them as catastrophic and unacceptable. And so they betrayed them. They decided that they were no longer singing that song. And they decided to invent another song. To the eyes of those who were in the previous society, they were traitors, they were incomprehensible. I'm thinking, for example, of the many, many deserters from Christian Europe in early modernity who joined the ranks of the Arab Berber corsairs, so the Muslim corsairs in North Africa. That is a fascinating history. Usually, when we talk about pirates, this is a little aside, we have that kind of Jack Sparrow imagination, the pirates were all in the Caribbean. The biggest pirates' republics were in the Mediterranean in the same exact period of time. Splendid, enormous, much bigger than La Tortuga. Those are fascinating histories that show us how it is possible to do this. Today, again, we are in similar situations. Many of us live in societies where we are given false dilemmas about what it means to belong, that there are some pre-established, objective, existing groups, and we either belong to these or we are traitors, or we are stupid. We cannot see the truth. Once again, we can exercise our ability to modify also the field of politics, so the field of what can be imagined politically by reimagining the field of the world. What are the things, the fundamental things that make up the world?
And I want to kind of go back a little bit to the core concept here because I remember a quote by a Syrian refugee who was talking about the war there, and she said everyone is lying, but the war is real. And so what is do you feel that there is a danger? And of course, there's different types of imagination, as you said. There's the fighting, there's the escape, so it's not just imagination just means that you go sit in a tree and ignore everything around you. But what do you feel is the danger or the power of that imagination with regards to addressing the reality around you? For instance, if there is a war that needs fighting, or if there's a forest that needs protecting, or some other issue that you could imagine.
Yeah, well, there is a double level to this question, I think. So, on the one hand, the role of imagination in a war has to do, for example, with something that anarchists or Marxists have discussed for many, many decades. If you are on a battlefield and you maybe are a factory worker, and in front of you, you see somebody else with a different uniform who's also maybe a factory worker, who do you see? Who is it, that person in front of you? Is it the enemy? Is it a comrade? Is it another human being like yourself? You see, at that level, you are operating on the imagination. So you are deciding how you make sense of that presence in your world through linguistic categories. They are, once again, they are all legitimate categories, but the consequences are very different. You see an enemy, you shoot. You see another human being or a comrade, and you interact in a different way. You desert together, for example. But not everything is entirely up for grabs. I don't want to get too technical, but we are entering, unfortunately, a technical problem in metaphysics. Metaphysics is that part of philosophy that deals with the fundamental elements of reality. The vast majority, the nigh totality of what we see around ourselves is a fiction, so something that we create through our imagination. However, there are literally three things that we can say for certain exist. They exist not just in our imagination, but absolutely they belong to reality. What are these three things? Yeah, the only three things of which we can be certain. We can have absolute certainty. The first is existence. The world might be a dream. I might be a brain in a machine or whatever else you want. These all might be a dream. But existence is. We exist. At least I exist. The second is awareness. Once again, this might all be a dream, everything might be an illusion, yet I am aware of this illusion. And the third thing of which I can say for certain is suffering. This existence, which is aware, has a tendency or a availability to suffer. So existence as one, awareness as one, and suffering as the mode of experience of this one being, these are the three things we know for certain. Everything else we can safely assume it's a fantasy. Now, in the case of a war, once again, what we see is that we have a great turmoil, a storm of fantasies with some very real consequences in terms of suffering. So if we have to decide whether we want to fight to defend a flag, which is a fantasy, or if we want to fight to soothe pain, which is one of the very few, as I was saying, literally three aspects that we can say for certain is part of reality, I think a wise decision would be to go on the side of what's real rather than on the side of the fantasy, which means manipulating the fantasies in order to protect the real.
Beautifully put. And speaking of fantasies, something that is also, of course, very prevalent here are myths. And you write, quote, myths are windows opening onto the backstage of our imagination, where the scenography of the world reveals its scaffolding. They show us that the ideas upon which we establish our life are fictions, but that fictions can help us bear our condition as mortal creatures thrown into an infinite universe, end quote. And of course, I mean, we are myth makers, we're storytellers. We are stories, right? We create the story of self. Um, and for instance, I've done a lot of research into the Vikings. It's difficult to separate the two because there isn't any historical documentation that they wrote themselves that it still exists. So it might be like Ibn Fadlan writing about them, or it's some Icelandic dude 200 years after the fact with clear anti-pagan disdain. And as a journalist, we write the first draft of history, and as an organizer, I know how vital history is, particularly those histories that are purposely covered up, like the history of grassroots organizing and struggle. But there's more to it than just that, the history of stories, of myths. And as you write, the kind of events that never actually happened but are always, this is something that's really never discussed or uncovered. So, what do you feel the importance in these struggles that we have today of just, trying to minimize pain wherever we can in the little pockets of the world where we exist? What do you feel the importance of these myths, be they current myths or historical myths?
Well, at the moment, there is a big mythographical struggle happening worldwide. So we have, for example, new mythologies emerging from the ultra-right, and a resistance to the very notion of myth, I think misguidedly, coming from the left. So the idea that you oppose what is called as the regime of post-truth with truth. I understand the sentiment behind this. I think that philosophically it's a weak position in the sense that we would need to be able, once again, to assert our access to the truth in order to be able to uphold it. Now, we want to be a little bit more sophisticated than that. It is time today, I believe, politically to embrace the idea that the future of what we're going to be able to do or what we will think is possible to do depends on the kind of myth that we tell ourselves. What is a myth? A myth is exactly what I was describing as a world. A myth is a narrative reconstruction of something that has a very vague ephemeral relationship with reality, exactly like the world is an ephemeral relationship with reality, that is tailored to our taste as human beings, for example, the taste for narrative, a taste for participation, and so on and so forth, but also that leaves a space of action. So myths are vague also in that way. You can project yourself, but you also retain a distance from it. Very important lesson from myths. I think it's important that we enter once again the arena of myth making unashamedly. So, claiming that the important aspect of a myth is not its truthfulness, is its usefulness. Is its usefulness. For example, I'll give you an example. The notion that the notion that there is such a thing as humanity, the notion that human life has innate value and worth, this is a mythological story. There is absolutely no objective backup to this. What in the universe shows the human life as worth? Nothing. It's a myth. But this is not a problem. It's a very useful myth. It's thanks to this myth that we can create institutions of a certain kind, that we can structure our life together in a particular way. It's a myth worth retaining, precisely as a myth. The moment we forget that it's a myth, the moment we start thinking that it's just a fact, we become complacent with it. So we let it die. Myths need nurturing. Like every story, if you stop singing them, they disappear. Okay? And also, we start maybe also making a general mistake in thinking that our mythological ideology is the truth and punishing those who do not agree as heretics. This is another mistake that I think we have made. Now, embracing the position of the narrator allows you to intervene also politically in the sphere of politics in a much more sophisticated way, and is also a much more effective way. You understand how to get to also the winning over of other people to your story without necessarily going through repression, which has been another problem we've had.
Yeah, absolutely. That we have. And I mean, there's I want to dig in a little bit to like the religiosity of myths as well. Because it's sometimes the topic or the theme, but sometimes not of myths. And in particular, there's kind of push and pull between God as the point of a spear and God as creators and inspiration for creativity, for solidarity, for intellectualism. And in the book, there were several times where I was reminded of some of the Jewish mysticism that I've read, not least of all the Sefer Yetzirah, which was banned at the temple that I went to growing up, for obvious reasons if you read it. So there's this very subversive history of religious imagination. And I think there's also this kind of there's this binary push to say religion good or religion bad. There's like in the US, it's like, oh, the Christians are insane because they're all burning crosses, or the Muslims are insane because they're all bombing buildings. Like it's a very clear cut binary. There's no room for the nuance that exists there. Um, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the religious stories, the religious myths that shape these worlds, often in contradictory ways, and why that's also an important aspect of our existence. Like, why do we need gods? Why do we need these world makers in our mythology?
Religion. Well, religion has many aspects once again as well. There is an aspect of religion that today is the most prevalent. Religion has to do also with the creation of communities. It's implied in certain terms. The term synagogue, for example, from the Greek means assembly, exactly like the Greek term for church. Ecclesia means an assembly of people. So there is this idea that a religion has a social aspect of community making. Community making always has some difficulties that come with it: the exercise of power, the punishment of deviants, the establishment of laws, and so on and so forth. These aspects of religion are the least religious ones. So they are the moments in a religious world that go the furthest away, so to say, from God, and they go the closest to government and empire. In the history of religions, we have seen that, of course, this relationship is very strong. But religion, if it was only this, it would be basically a weak form of government. You could do much better the organization of communities through other means. You don't need religion for that. So what is it that makes religion a specific and unique part of the human imagination? Religion does only one thing better than any other part of our imagination. It deals with the limit of our mind, similarly to poetry. Now, poetry is some sort of like a little walk along the edge of our imagination, along the edge of what we can think, what we can know, what we can say. It's a walk on the edge of language. That's why it's such familiarity with silences, poetry. Religion is precisely the same thing, is a walk on the edge of language, of thinking, of knowledge, of understanding, of perception, but it's also the moment in which you try to look beyond the limit. Okay? You have this acknowledgement, not just of the limit, but an acknowledgement of what there is beyond, the ineffable, the infinite mystery, the impenetrable chaos of reality. That's what you usually call God. Okay? God is that which is beyond the narrow limits of the world, which translated epistemologically is acknowledging the reality far exceeds and transcends the limits of our mind, which is a very safe and very basic and modest thing that any thinker should recognize. We call it God because we need a narrative approach to the concept. The concept itself is self-effacing because it's not a concept. It's a concept of the fact there are things beyond concepts. This aspect of religion is essential, I think, uh, to any serious attempt at producing understanding. Okay, so any theory of knowledge worthy of its name has to acknowledge and accept that it is limited, and thus has to acknowledge and somehow point towards the fact that there is more to it than that. That is religion. This has very little to do with community making, has very little to do with issuing laws and institutions and stuff like that. In every religious tradition, there are people that emphasize this aspect more. They're usually called mystics. mystics are the ones that, even in front of the more apparently legal aspect of a religion, the Quran is full of edicts and laws, and so is the Jewish Bible, for example. But they take these things and they completely transform their meaning. Okay, they cannot believe that the relationship that reality has towards the world is that of daddy that tells you what to do and what not to do. It's nonsensical. And so the mystic gives an alternative hermeneutic interpretation to all these things. Unfortunately, what we can witness at the moment in the so-called great religious sphere is the progressive disappearance of the mystic and the rise of the legalist, of the community maker disguised as a religious person. This is a great loss, similar to the disappearance of poetry that we have witnessed in literature. The two unfortunately seem to go together.
Yeah, and I'm reminded years ago I interviewed a scientist, I can't recall his name. He had just published some work on how humans don't see reality, but not in a philosophical sense, in a very scientific sense, that we aren't evolved to do so, that we only see what helps us survive and fulfill our hierarchy of needs, eating, sleeping, drinking water, sex, etc. And so he proved that we don't see reality. And this was met with, a scientific, oh, that's interesting. That's interesting. But when you say that in a religious sphere, it's all of a sudden frightening, and it requires a daddy to tell you what to do about that. And it requires somebody on the other side to tell you it's okay because I know what's going on, even if you don't. And this is not to pedestal science because I don't think that there's that binary, but it almost seems that the argument here is that imagination can also be a shield in a way to 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 deflect this kind of need for something that is so absolute, and that you can accept that, okay, I don't know, and maybe that's okay, and maybe I don't need to know because I have this space of imagination, and it doesn't have to be this monolith again, and kind of going back to this myriad existence as opposed to a very singular and structured and rigid one, which really does not vibe with how we live.
Yeah, but imagination is a shield, and that's why we need it. So let's return for a moment to where we are. We were born without knowing why, how, where, or when. The problem of life is not only the why, why am I alive? What am I for? But every other question we don't know. So we are in a state of absolute bafflement and ignorance about what the hell is going on. And in this situation, not only we didn't receive a user's guide when we came into the world, but nobody else around us has ever found out anything. Okay, so if we were to face the existential condition in the rawest possible way, barren, without mediation, we would require a very strong mental physique. The mystics are very few, not only because they are an elected elite, but mostly because it takes a certain physique to be a mystic. Okay, it's not for everyone. Maybe it's not even for me. Okay, um, and so we need the imagination to create a shield towards reality and chaos, to imagine that we are in a comprehensible, nice world that where there is time and space and different identities, when we can have plans and ambitions and all this kind of stuff. We need it. But we also need to be aware that it is a fantasy, and we need to be aware that there is something beyond it. Now, how can we relate to reality without panicking? It's not difficult, actually, to relate to reality without panicking. There is a feeling often that if we think about reality, we risk getting completely lost. And so that outside of the world, we vanish. But according to the very little that we know about reality, as I was saying earlier, three things. But the first one is reality is the fact that things are, is the mysterious, incomprehensible event that think that there is something rather than nothing, and that this existence is eternally, without the contrary. We have knowledge absolutely of existence, not of non-existence. Non-existence is a fantasy, once again, is a logical derivative of existence. This means that when you get out of the world, when you die, for example, or when you are ejected from the world and sunk into reality, however disconcerting it might be from your perspective as a human being, you do not vanish, you do not disappear. Okay, your existence is an eternity, okay, is an eternal event. This should relax us a bit when we think about making the shield of our imagination too rigid, okay, as if our very existence depended on it. Thankfully, our existence depends on reality and is always already granted. In theology, you can say it is as apokatastasis, the fact that everything is always already saved.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, and yeah, I wish we did have more mystics, more poets too. And I kind of want to shift with the time that we have. There was another point that I wanted to bring up because nostalgia plays a huge role in politics in the US now, which remembering something better than it was. So again, creating a myth of the past that you try to find these footholds and handholds that are based in history, like, oh, this used to be part of the reality, but then you just create this farce. You know, people do this with the Vikings all the time, which bothers me, which is a different story. But you know, the great America that we have to get back to, the cleaner, pure Sweden or Italy or what have you. And you write in the book that nostalgia can either be a project or a projection. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about this distinction and how one is part of this larger shield of imagination and the other one is really the train that we're on right now, which is not a great one.
Yeah, nostalgia is a very powerful force at the moment. Absolutely. I think especially in your part of the world, even stronger than in the place where I am at the moment. Um, yeah, it has to do with a relationship with the past, in a sense, but also a relationship with possibilities. In the kind of Make America Great Again type nostalgia, you have a fantasy, which is that of a previous America that was wonderful and so on and so forth. This fantasy is not recognized by the people that uphold it as a fantasy. Is recognized, and they do a lot of work actually. They try their very best to present it as a fact, as a real fact. And this fact not only is a fact, but is a destiny. Because America was this, and this comes previous to what is now, that is the natural essence of the United States and thus the destiny. And any deviation from this destiny is an aberration and it goes against the nature. Okay, so Europe is white and thus that's its destiny, and any welcoming of Muslims or whatever else is an aberration, thus we should go back. Your government is very active at the moment, lobbying European governments in doing this. Now, first of all, not only this is not historically sound in any form, but also it's a misunderstanding of what the past is. The past is not just a series of facts. The past is a series of possibilities. Facts themselves, even when they are in the past, they are never one thing. They are as many things as there are perspectives on it. This is something that we have learned in history, for example, from the 20th century onwards, with people like Marc Bloch or Lucien Febvre and the School of the Annales, when they started studying how the individual person made sense of their experience of being a medieval peasant or a woman in the Middle Ages or something else. So when we look at the past, we're looking at a multitude of events that were experienced in very different ways by many different people. Each of them contained as a seed a possibility of making sense of that particular era. Why do we care about the past? To what extent does the past give us a destiny? It doesn't give us a destiny in any form, okay? It doesn't influence us in any form that is objective and necessary. But every moment in the past is an opportunity for us to imagine how things could be, or have been, or will be. That is how you have nostalgia, not as a project of reinstating a state of affairs that was natural, objective, and a destiny, but as a projection, as a sandbox projection of a possibility around which you can dance in your present and you can use to modify the way you're making world at your particular time. This is how I think we should relate more with the past. And another note on that, the past is wide and large and is populated by creatures that were very much like us. Biologically, at least, human beings from for the past 50,000 years have not changed at all. And all of them shared our same very strange situation of being born not knowing anything and had the same problems as us. So many of the challenges that they faced are relevant to us. They are very relevant to us. They are our siblings, these people from the distant past. We should look at them not only with the eye of the archaeologist. I love archaeology, is a lot of fun, but it's maybe not the most effective way of looking at the past. We should look at them literally as comrade to comrade and sharing tips and learning from them how they made sense of their situation, which is our situation, and seeing all the answers they gave once again as possibilities.
Beautifully put. And I feel like I could sit here and talk to you for hours, but I understand you have a life to live. So I'm gonna let everyone know again, this book, please go read it because it's just, I mean, it's just beautifully written. And again, the concepts, as we've discussed here today, are amazingly profound and very timely, I suppose, as they always are. The eternal return, as Nietzsche would put it. Otherworlds, Mediterranean Lessons on Escaping History. Federico Campagna, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with us and discuss your book and your work. I so appreciate it.
Thank you, Eleanor. It's been a pleasure. See you next time.